What's on my mind today? Counterspell. To a lesser degree, Dispel Magic. Mainly Counterspell. Counterspell is kind of a neat idea. A counterspell mechanic has been in D&D since at least 3rd edition. It probably predates that, but I have less experience with older editions. Counterspelling in 3rd edition is difficult at the best of times. You can build your class around it, and then it gets a lot easier. But if you're not specifically built to be a counterspell specialist, it required, let me see if I can remember, you had to ready an action to counter a spell, so you had to know it was coming. It took up your turn to do. You had to have the exact same spell prepared, or another spell that specifically says it counters the spell that you were going to counter. When the enemy cast their spell, you had to, you had to make a spellcraft roll to identify what spell they were casting, see if you have the appropriate spell that can counter it, and then you expend your slot and it counters their spell. So, at the best of times, you're breaking even. It's a really bad idea generally. 5th edition, and there's no counterspell in 4th edition, but in 5th edition, they came up with making Counterspell its own spell, which on the surface kind of makes sense. There's a certain logic to that. I'm kind of down for it. And I'm getting hair in my mouth, which is, really distracting. Yes, Counterspell is now a spell by itself. It makes a lot of sense. Approaching it from a 3rd edition perspective, having it be its own spell really makes a lot of sense. You don't have to build your entire character around it, but it does still cost character building resources. It can counter any spell, but there are restrictions, and you might need to make a roll to do so. On the surface, at first glance, this seems like a marked improvement. But in hindsight, and hindsight's always like this, isn't it? Counterspell is an always feel bad mechanic. It's always going to spoil somebody's gameplay. Either you are able to counter the enemy's spell, in which case, cool, they burned an action. They lose their turn and don't get to do anything else because you used Counterspell. Or you have to make a roll, or in the 2024 version, actually, they make a save. Basically, if the die goes badly, you have used your slot and your reaction for no benefit. And that feels bad, too. So either way, somebody's getting spoiled. Somebody's gameplay is going to be like, well, that sucks. Well, that was a waste. Do you see the problem here? Somebody is having their turn ruined, or their action ruined, or your spell slot ruined, or your resources wasted, or what have you. Somebody is getting dumped on every time Counterspell is used. Every time. And it's interesting that this is seen as acceptable in the 5th edition community. In a lot of games, that would be bad design. I mean, it is bad design, to be clear. It is bad design. In a lot of games, the community would point at that and say, well, that feels pretty bad. I don't like that. We're not going to use that. The thing is that Counterspell is kind of mandatory in 5th edition. Spells are so bonkers. They're so far off the chain all the time. You kind of have to take Counterspell, or else you are leaving yourself completely vulnerable. Your butt's hanging out in the wind, and somebody's going to slap it. You have to have Counterspell to protect yourself, because otherwise your party is going to get hit by some wayward spell that completely turns the encounter around, and you're dead. You need Counterspell. It is foolish not to take Counterspell because it is so powerful, because spells themselves are so powerful. So in a manner of speaking, Counterspell has to exist. In a game where spells are as powerful as they are in 5th edition, you have to have some sort of measures against them, some sort of defense. You need Counterspell. To a lesser extent, Dispel Magic. The issue with Dispel Magic, of course, is that it doesn't stop the spell from taking effect to begin with. So oftentimes, by the time you're able to cast Dispel Magic, it's too late. But you also want to have Dispel Magic. Counterspell is mandatory for any kind of reasonably optimized party because spells are too strong. But because the game now requires you to have this damned if you do, damned if you don't, either the player is going to feel like they've wasted their spell, or the DM is going to be like, well, my bad guy doesn't get to do their cool thing and challenge the party. And this encounter, think any encounter with like a main bad guy enemy spellcaster. If there's counterspell in the party, that spellcaster is not going to feel threatening. They're not going to get to do their stuff. This shuts down any kind of like narrative tension, because the bad guy is going to be like, oh, I can't do anything, especially if there's 2 counterspellers in the party, because of course the insanity of 5th edition, you can be casting a spell, someone counters you, and you cast another spell to counter their counterspell. So if the party has a second counterspeller, they can counter that counterspell. This is where 5th edition devolves to, if you get right down to it. Like on paper, having this back and forth duel of wizards. I'm going to cast a spell. I'm going to counter that. I'm going to counter yours. Well, I'm going to counter yours. Like on paper, that sounds neat. If there were good mechanics for it, it could be. But there isn't. It's just, mark off a resource. You don't get to do your thing. You just don't. Or make a roll and you just don't. Or I spend my resource and make a roll. I don't get anything. I think the big issue is, there's 2 big issues. One, it's so all or nothing. It's so all or nothing. If you either completely negate the spell and nothing happens at all, or nothing happens and it's a complete waste. There's nothing in between. Which kind of comes down to the general design philosophy of D&D, which tends to be more, binary results. Either all or nothing, or sometimes it's all or half, You only get that. There's a lot fewer mechanics in D&D than in other games, which can result in a sort of diminished effect, other than like save for half damage kind of stuff. The other big thing is that because it feels so mandatory, because like you feel obligated, or at least I feel obligated to take Counterspell to ruin somebody's turn to protect the party, because a counterspell is inherently a defensive tool. You don't usually use it to counter defensive spells. You use it to counter spells that are going to let the enemy get away or let them dominate the party, like to beat the party. So you're going to use it on, to defend against offensive spells or to stop enemies from escaping. Those are the primary uses of counterspell, I would think. Because it feels so mandatory, it actually, I don't know, it's kind of this issue that I've had with the way that that spells are distributed, particularly 3rd level spells. Because 3rd level, you get Counterspell, you get Dispel Magic, you get Remove Curse, these sort of these silver bullet options. And there's no more silver of a silver bullet than Counterspell. But these are silver bullet remedies for problems, and you have to have them. If an adventure is written for 5th level characters, it assumes that you have these options, Remove Curse, Dispel Magic. There's going to be times when, if you don't have those, you're just kind of screwed. Sometimes in some Wizards of the Coast adventures, you're kind of screwed anyways, because they do stuff that requires you to have those spells before you can possibly have them. So there's that too. But the point being that, as soon as a party hits 5th edition, they are assumed to have these silver bullet remedies. And if you don't take them, you are kind of screwing yourself over. These specific cures or defenses against devastating, debilitating effects that enemies, monsters, traps, environments, whatever, can inflict on you. I'm generally not a fan of silver bullet style design. even if it is done really well, and it can be done well. For example, see Android Netrunner is a card game that is based around silver bullet design. You have some generally powerful options, but then there's a lot of cards that are like, this card is very specifically meant to address this situation. And it does so pretty much with impunity. There's a lot of that. And it's done really well. I still don't care for it. I would prefer general solutions so that, because if you have 2 or 3 general solutions with a lot of overlap but different specializations, then you feel free to pick whichever one you like, whichever one fits your style better. But if you have, some general solutions that are just kind of moderately effective, and you have one that's like instant kill werewolves, well, if I'm in a campaign where I expect to see werewolves, I feel like I kind of have to take that, don't I? The more specialized the thing becomes and the more silver bullet it is, the less choice there is, really. Like, it's not a real choice to take it or not. You take it if it applies to the situations that you're in. And in 5th edition, like, there's a lot of, especially 3rd level spells. Like, that seems to be the worst offender in this regard, is 3rd level spells tend to be silver bullet defenses or cures for like common effects, petrification, curses, permanent magical effects, or the saber suck at the things, that gets on you gotta dispel magic, or you gotta remove curse. Enemy spellcasters are gonna wipe out your whole party in a single action. Well, nope, counterspell. You have to have them, or else the campaign might come to a very sudden end. And I don't like that very much. I think that's pretty bad design. But that is a slightly to the side topic. Mainly, I wanted to talk about Counterspell being this, like, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like, somebody's getting screwed over. It's just a matter of who. It's a feel bad either way. There should be better defensive tools that don't result in somebody just completely missing out and completely losing whatever, either the action they were spending or the spell slot they spent, like just completely losing out. But like at the same time, you can't fix Counterspell. You can't reasonably fix Counterspell until you have fixed how bonkers and insane all the spells in 5th edition are. So like, it's a problem that's buried under a mountainous other problem. And that is the story of 5th edition. Like, that's the problem with trying to write anything for 5th edition, trying to do any kind of like homebrew work, is that you identify the thing you want to fix. In this case, I don't like how Counterspell works. And then you think, well, before I fix that, I have to fix all this other stuff. Like, honestly, the amount of work it would take to fix the spells in 5th edition probably constitutes hundreds of hours of work. Like, I think in 200 hours of work, what is that? That's like 5 weeks. I think 5 work weeks, like solid full-time work weeks, could get it done. Yeah, I think so. But like, that's a lot to try to fix a system. So, I mean, I'm not gonna. You might. I'm not gonna. But anyways, yeah. I had some thoughts about Counterspell and the implications of trying to fix them. They're driving me a little nuts.